So the first framework we're going to use to judge whether something, an act or a behaviour is ethical or not, is the framework of ethical egoism. So it's a consequentialist framework, and we can see that a consequentialist framework means that we judge the ethics of something by the outcome. If you've ever heard the phrase, the ends justifies the means, they're basically dealing with a consequentialist framework in making that judgment, right? So the ends, the outcome is how you decide whether something is good or right, not how you actually get that outcome. So you can do a bad thing to get a good outcome. If you believe that's ethical, then that's a consequentialist approach to ethics. Ethical egoism particularly concentrates on judging the action based upon your own outcome. Okay, it's got good here, but it could be outcome. So you look at should you do this act and how you judge it, whether it's ethical. It's ethical if it's good for you. Okay, so you look at the consequences of the possible decision set you've got, and you predict and analyze that. And if you have more positive consequences for you, so the agent means for you, if there's more positive consequences for you compared to other alternatives, then that action is the morally right choice. This is really important to understand conceptually. It's morally right to do that. So it's morally wrong not to do it. Okay. So this theory of ethical egoism actually proposes that it's morally wrong not to do something that's in your best interest. Now, before we get too carried away with what that means, that all it means is you got to go out and have lots of sex and drugs and stuff, it doesn't actually mean that, right? Because there's no clear prescription on what good is or kind of what your best interests are. And so you might actually act in ways that other people consider ethical under this theory. For instance, you might cooperate with people. You might be honest over the long term. Why? Why would you do that? You might do that because if you cooperate with people, it's good for you over the long term because others will cooperate back. You might be honest because then you get a great reputation, which has lots of benefits. So it doesn't actually mean that you become just this short-term self-centered person, right? That's only looking after hedonism in the short term. It doesn't mean that, but it does mean that you really only consider your interests. And it's not very clear, it's not clearly defined as to what your best interests are, right? That's up to you to decide. So as we can see, it doesn't mean about taking the easy option. It can involve making sacrifices if it improves your best interests over the longer term. So if we look at the positives of ethical egoism, we find that really it at least takes our point of view into account. It recognises that we should look after ourselves. The second thing is it puts the emphasis on us, right? We know what's good for us, and that should be part of the decision-making set. Ethical egoism also allows us to act cooperatively, right? It doesn't say you have to act short-term. So there are positives with approaching an ethical dilemma from this perspective, to understand what's good for you, to make sure that's reflected in the decision set, but also to concentrate on that longer-term aspect about what's good for you. So perhaps the key problem facing ethical egoism as a theory is that it seems to conflict with our understanding of what ethics is. You might remember that this little diagram that we had last week, self, others, good, when we were talking about integrity, and said, look, ethics and integrity and what's the right thing to do generally involves insight into what is good or right based on the relationship between the self and others. Okay, so the self and others were part of one of the core things that are required to have an ethical theory. So several moral philosophers would suggest ethical egoism isn't even really an ethical theory. Why? Because it really is only related to the one person, to the agent, or to you when you're making these decisions. It doesn't actually deal with the relationship between the self and others. Because of that, it's partial and biased. prioritising you as the decision maker over everyone else and not taking those others into account. Now, when we do that, when we bias just one party, particularly yourself, it can lead to justification for acts or behaviours that most people would agree are not ethical. Things like discrimination, or even darker things such as hurting other people. You know, if for some reason that caused you in the long term pleasure, etc., then you'd be ethically justified in doing it under this theory. So there's some real problems about the kind of acts that can be justified with this approach. Finally, we return to that problem of ethical relativism. Right? If morality is entirely subjective, so if whether something is ethical depends upon the agent's perception, that's what subjectivity means. So in ethical egoism, it's whether the agent perceives it to be good for them. Right? So it's a subjective judgment. That's an important concept when we come to law too. But so if the morality is subjective or depends upon the agent's perception, then we've got the same problems that we had with ethical relativism. It's that ethics is really only a matter of individual taste or opinion. You can't criticise others, you can't make moral progress, and so on. So there's some fairly significant problems when we come to applying ethical egoism. It's a fairly unidimensional theory, and there are real problems about whether it actually even is an ethical theory or framework as we might normally think about it. So the final point to make about ethical egoism is that we need to distinguish it from psychological egoism. So psychological egoism actually suggests that people actually do act in their own self-interest. Now, what's really important to recognise here is psychological egoism is a descriptive theory, right? It's saying that's what people do. It's not saying that's what people should do. Okay? That's a really important distinction. If you're saying that's what people should do, right, then we're in ethical egoism. So it's that difference between a descriptive theory and a normative theory. We're focusing here on the normative theory. And part of the challenge too is that even under the psychological theory, psychological egoism, we find that there are people who do things which, you know, really don't appear to be, you know, in any way rationally able to be described as in their own self-interest. So there are clear cases such as self-sacrifice, where people give their lives for other people, where we would argue that we're not even really seeing psychological egoism applying all the time. So with ethical egoism out of the way, it's time to concentrate on one of the really most well-known ethical frameworks, utilitarianism.